federal year 25 IPPS proposed rule. There's a lot of content in this document and in our presentation. We do our best to provide the industry as much valuable information as we can, in particular about cost reporting and reimbursement issues, as they relate to the rule when it comes out. So we're going to move relatively quickly through a lot, and then certain areas today we're going to focus on what we'll call the more significant changes, or maybe even the more complicated changes, just things to help everyone wrap their head around what to be thinking about in federal year 25. In particular, there's there's some things going on with the labor market changes for wage index and provider status, if you're critical access or sole community. And we'll spend some time today talking about those labor market changes, as well as the other new proposals that came out this year. So with me today, I'll be kind of moderating the discussion. I have my colleagues, Ryan Sater is going to cover a lot of the labor market discussion, and also the wage index piece. Mr. Robert Howley is going to discuss some of the changes with Medicare's proposal on the TEAMS model, what's going on that's not even a proposed change, but an actual change request that came through on how CMS is going to calculate outlier reconciliations going forward. And then our friend Tom Hubner is going to talk about the changes with graduate medical education, the new slots that are available, and I think there's a couple hospitals that have closed recently where nearby hospitals can apply for those caps. So we'll cover all those things. Like I said, it's a resource document. We are recording, not using what's this called, a stenographer, something like that. In fact, this wouldn't record. This would just play music back at you, but I think it looks nice for this. This is basically, if you want to work your way through the proposal or the proposed rule presentation, this is how you would, this is how it's organized. So, we're going to talk about the rate setting, like I said, wage index, DISH, and then go through some of the changes here with Outlier team. And then we wanted to provide a little bit more insight in terms of where some of the major changes are occurring. So there's an addendum where we look at the DRGs that had the biggest swings between positive and negative between 24 and 25. And then a pretty detailed analysis on all the counties that have changed CBSAs with the new labor markets. And we broke down hospital types within each of those counties. So you can keep your eyes peeled for your hospitals. If you fall within one of those counties, you definitely want to just make sure that you're covered and that you're doing everything that you can to compliantly optimize your reimbursement. So our focus areas of the rule, again, there's so much, right? There's 5,000 pages, maybe more. Obviously, we don't read the whole thing. We read, like I said, the edit search function for the proposed rule is a wonderful tool to use as you go through this. But we really focus in on what are those areas that are impacting cost reporting and reimbursement, because that's the firm that Toyon is here. And then we want to help guide the industry with what some of those comments can be to hopefully increase payments. I mean, that's usually the goal of comments, is to make sure Medicare in particular with the market basket that they give out is reflective of actual cost inflation. And then, just letting you all know, if there are changes, if there are certain actions that hospitals need to take, we'll kind of lay out what we think those actions are, what the timing of those actions are. Ryan will talk about, for instance, if you're going to withdraw from a Medicare geographic classification reclassification, there's certain dates for that. So we want to pinpoint all those things. Again, it's trying to help everyone understand how to react to this rule and the things that relate to hospital reimbursement. Comments are due June 10th. You can follow this link. It should bring you right there. When you get to that link to upload your comments, there's a button to click. If you still wanted to send it by mail, Medicare gives you a separate mailing address. And if it's overnight mail, the last second deal, and you got to put it in FedEx or something, there's a separate address for that. It's discussed in the. All right, so I guess as we get going too, if there are questions, we'll be looking out for those questions. So, and I have no problem pausing and having the discussion right there. And then also even waiting towards the end if there's anything else that comes up. What I'll also say as we get started too is Toyon is, this is going to be available on our website. So if there's certain folks from your team that weren't able to make it today, this will be a public presentation for someone to watch later on. We'll also be sending out our news you need to know that really details this as more of an article format of what we talked about today. When we send that out, there'll be a link that will allow you to go to Toyon's website and plug in your provider number and see the estimated change as it relates to the new rates that are coming out for your hospital. So again, that's helpful with budgeting and things, and really, again, to keep your eyes peeled for if there's something proposed in the rule and there's an action you can take, you certainly want to know about it and take that action. So basically about a 2.4% overall update in national payments year over year with the rates they put out for 25 compared to 24. That's about a $3 billion increase in overall IPPS payments. We're going to break down the uncompensated care DSH payment later, but this means a good year that they finally were seeing an uptick in the national uncompensated care DSH pool over the past 2 or 3 years. It's been going down, so we'll talk about why it's going back up and really want to make sure it stays that way between proposed and final and what might be around the corner with some of the estimates that Medicare uses on that pool. There's some money going out for this buffer stock deal for small independent hospitals. So not a great deal of government spend, but it is new money they're pumping into the PPS system. Notable decreases though, if you're a provider that receives the low volume adjustment, and Robert Howie's going to talk about this later, or if you're a Medicare dependent hospital, both of those provisions are set to expire during 2025 at some point. Historically, Congress has enacted legislation to continue these programs. I think the Medicare dependent status has been going on for over 30 years. Low volume, what I'll call the more relaxed rules for that low volume adjustment have been going on for a few years as well. So we'll see, I would expect at least the Medicare dependent status to be continued. I hope the low volume changes aren't reverted back to what I'll call the harder criteria to qualify. But we'll have to wait and see, if there's any legislation or pork barrel language that comes out to cover those programs for the remainder of federal year 25. So what's going on here is the market basket's a 3% increase. We have some slides after this that show how hospital cost for Medicare beneficiaries is more than 3%. If you look at the most recent data from your cost reports or that we pull from the Medicare HCRA system, they're taking out, like they will, that ACA adjustment that helps pay for the ACA. The one thing that we don't see here, so if you're a part of that ATRA-MACRA appeal, they did not add that 0.9412 back to the rates. If you recall, ATRA-MACRA, there was an $11 billion spend that they had to put back into the rates, and Medicare was short pumping back in that $11 billion. And so there's a lot of appeals out there, saying that hospitals are entitled to that 0.9412% adjustment. So as we get further into additional years, that 0.9412, which is about 1% of your overall IPPS payments, is going to be compounded with the market basket adjustment. So it's going to go up. And so I think we estimated at a 0.96 about or something like that when you account for that market basket. So again, something you want to pay attention to that appeal. If you're not appealing that issue, feel free to reach out. We're always happy to talk to you more about, that opportunity. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. And again, I always, Robert in particular gives me grief because I exhaust the presentation before he gets a chance to talk. So I want to make sure other people get a good chance to talk about their sections. And I don't just flap my gums, over and over again. But so this comes up often, and it's not, we don't have to be experts of this slide, obviously, but it's just good to know, okay, when CMS says that they're giving us an update of 2.6%. What does that mean? And it's convoluted by all this budget neutrality deal, all these adjustments that ensure that the Medicare spend is within the budget for the year. Now, so just so you guys know, what happens is they actually start with the 24 rates, and they remove those prior year budget neutrality factor adjustments. So if you were to take this 4392 and divide it by all of these factors, you would get the 24 rate without all of those adjustments, and that's the 25 starting point. And then what 25 does is it says, okay, what are the 25 budget neutrality factors? And then you take the gross rate, you net it down by those budget neutrality factors, and that's how you get the labor and non-labor payment that is in Table 1A of the proposed and final rule when it comes out. And that's also why when CMS tells you you're getting a 2.6% update, you sometimes could look at your rates and do it like a variance analysis year over year, and it doesn't equal 2.6%. You might say, well, why, when I look at my labor, non-labor as a variance year over year, it doesn't equal 2.6%. That's because of these budget neutrality adjustments. And so another way to look at it is, here's the 2.6% adjustment, and these are all the things that kind of net against that adjustment in terms of budget neutrality. And so when various appeals that go on in the industry, and there has been successful appeals, sometimes challenge the accuracy of these budget neutrality factors. But they're really a central part of how the rates are set, and good to understand that they at least affect the standard operating and labor and non-labor share. And again, if you were, a hospital that didn't get the full update, this 2.6% could be 0.035%, or if you're not a meaningful user, it's a different percentage. And again, it's just starts here and then is aggregated as an update with all these budget neutrality factor adjustments. Okay, so don't want to get overly confusing, but wanted to just at least cover that piece, as if you're in reimbursement, it's a little bit interesting. The other thing that we look at is, okay, well, Medicare is giving us a 2.6% update factor. Is that right? In a lot of the associations I think that we all work with will say, hey, even AHA will say that we don't think that this update factor represents the true incremental cost to hospitals that they've been incurring, especially since COVID-19 and some of those rising costs that have yet to stabilize. So when we look at across all providers over the past 4 years, this is CMI adjusted, so we back out acuity. The big thing that happened was from 19 to 20, it was an 8.3% increase, and providers really never got paid for that huge increase. Now, when you look at 20 to 21, it pretty much stayed flat. That's because there was such a large increase in 20. And now we're looking at another 5.7% increase if we look at the most recent federal year 22 cost reports that we could pull out of the HCRIS database. So when CMS is giving us 2.6 or 3%, it's not covering the actual cost per discharge that hospitals are incurring. We also like to look at this from the lens of, well, what if you're a sole community or Medicare dependent provider? Because I think the last time that those base rates were set were back in 2006. So if your base rate was set in 2006 and you're basically getting an update factor similar to that market basket update, again, there's been some very large, if you look from 19 to 20, it was about 8%, 21 even went up, probably close to the market basket there, but then another 5.5%. So, the thought for those folks getting the hospital-specific rate is, gee, is it time to rebase? Is it time to look at what our costs are today and start new, to recognize, these higher costs, given the new landscape of providing care that we're in. So to help, and we also share our comments, just so you know, but this is kind of how a lot of our comments are centered around an increase to the market basket. And I'll also say, as you all have access to this presentation, we'll email it out. You'll get a PDF version. There's a lot of links, so you could easily click on and kind of say, okay, what's this MedPAC report that we're talking about? in that MedPAC report, you would see that they recommend a 1.5% increase over whatever CMS's market basket is for 2025. So we certainly want to support that as the least that Medicare updates. And keep in mind, if Medicare were to update the market basket, there are some other downstream effects, notably in the uncompensated care pool, because that's a part of Factor 1 that's used to set up how much funding goes in for uncompensated care DISH. So this is an important recommendation. We made that recommendation last year. They didn't, wasn't applied. Doesn't mean we're not going to continue to ask for that going forward. We also don't want to forget that in the prior year's MedPAC report, MedPAC said that CMS's update market basket wasn't keeping up with the cost of inflation. And, there's been a discussion that, well, over time, things smooth out. But if you look at things over time, they haven't been smoothing out since COVID-19. And so the thought is, hey, look, when you true up that market basket, at a later point in time, we should start to account for the shortfall, that gap that Medicare is currently not covering on that cost inflation that providers are up against right now. So these are some comments that we're considering. We also put in consider rebasing that hospital-specific rate for sole community Medicare dependent providers. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but anybody interested, you probably are familiar with these numbers by now. Get the labor and non-labor share, depending if you get the full update versus being a meaningful user, or if you're submitting quality data but not a meaningful user, right? You get that reduced update. And this is kind of what I showed earlier, right? These percentages are the starting point, but then they go through budget neutrality adjustments. And what's interesting is, and again, this is math, but you'll see if we look here, this variance from 24, we're also, as we look at our analysis, comparing against 24 and 23. The full update is about 2.6%, but you see how that changes, right? Depending on this update factor, 2.6%, 2.8%. That's all because of the compounding of those budget neutrality factor adjustments that we talked about earlier. These are the other key factors that are going to affect many of your reimbursement from Medicare this year or for federal year 25. DISH went up again. It's about 9.5%. I looked at, when the pool goes up, the question is, what's the break-even point? Meaning, what's the relationship between the uncompensated care cost that a hospital reports versus the payment? And so a hospital's uncompensated care cost could have went down by about 8%, and you would have broke even because of the increase to the pool. So that's an interesting statistic. The fixed outlier threshold continues to go up, and CMS actually projects more providers to have outlier payments in 2025, and they're kind of messing a little bit with that, or proposing to add a little bit to the percent of spend. They estimate every year that 5.1% of all Medicare payments are for outliers. I think they're proposing to up that slightly, given their estimations. DRG weights, there's an addendum if you want to see, or that shows there's 25 DRGs that went up by 10% compared to 24, and there's 35 starting in 23, right? They were holding harmless. DRG weight can't go down more than 10%. There's 35 of those if you compare proposed 25 against 24, and you can see all that in Exhibit A here. This is not too applicable to providers. This application, these are for, manufacturers and drug or technology and drug developers. But I guess the takeaway on the new technology this year is there are 13 that are under review for the newness, cost, and clinical improvement criteria, 14 under review for the cost criteria, and a lot of these are related to sickle cell disease. And CMS is proposing only for 25 that a new technology payment related to sickle cell disease gene therapy is a 75% bump up instead of 65. And that's a complicated formula, but it does result into additional revenue for providers that are using those technologies. If you are a small independent provider, CMS is proposing 6 months buffer stock of medicine. Small provider is equal to or less than 100 beds. Independent means on the cost report, you're not showing that you have a home office. And so we kind of quoted, what lines they're looking for there. Providers that qualify for these medicines, there's about 86 of them, would likely get biweekly payments. It could be a lump sum, but it would probably be a biweekly payment deal, and they would true up everything against your Medicare's share of those costs against your cost report. Like I said, Medicare only expects to spend about $3 million, but it's still good for this subset of providers, no doubt. There's some changes to ESRD if you're an ESRD provider. My takeaway from this is right now there's this estimated cost of dialysis that uses 1 week as the estimate, and they're bumping that up to 3 sessions per week. So could be a good pickup in reimbursement. And so we kind of just show there's a base rate that's established depending on the calendar year to fiscal year relationship. They're going to multiply that times 3 to determine an ESRD add-on payment. So if you're an ESRD provider, you want to be aware of that. And hopefully that drives in some additional revenue for those services. I'm going to kick it over to my value-based purchasing friend, Robert Halley, to talk about this section. Robert, thank you, sir, and appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. So real quick with VBP, it is going to continue here, obviously, in fiscal year 25. Just a normal timetable with the VBP factors. We have proxy factors that are in 16A. I think 16B doesn't come out until the final rule. Really, that doesn't even get issued until later in the calendar year, probably closer to December. The payment pool is pretty much the same. Everyone's contributing about the 2% to the payment pool that's redistributed based on your composite score, so 1.7 billion. I definitely urge you to look at your scores because for 23 and 22, those were suppressed for VBP due to the pandemic. So now we're at post-pandemic data, which may have changed significantly to where they were pre-pandemic and how they're affecting your institution. So that information is, as far as the score is on the CMS website for the proposed rule and last year's final rule. But if you want to see more of the details as to each of the 4 domains, that information could be found on the CQI, the quality website. For the same thing with the hospital acquired condition program reduction program, this is going to continue in 25 as it is in 24. It was suppressed for 23. Hospitals that are in that lowest quartile receive the 1% reduction in IPPS payments. Again, I also urge you to look at if you met or you were in the subject to the reduction for fiscal year 24, that information did come out late as far as public. So if you're doing your 24 cost report, you're probably going to start seeing that. If you run a PSNR, you're going to see that 1% reduction. What I've seen with some of these is that hospitals who were not subject to the reduction, they had a complete 180 turnaround to where they are now subject to the hack reduction. So this must have just come out of left field for them. Understanding that your quality team reports this information, they're not finance people. They don't know the results of that information. So I definitely urge you that are in the reimbursement department to really evaluate what the impact is. Push that information up to your quality as well as your finance department, because this is a 1% reduction is really significant there. The hospital readmissions reduction program, really no changes with that, continues in fiscal year 25. Pretty much all hospitals are subject to at least some sort of reduction under the HERP program. Remember, it is limited to no more than a 3% reduction. Most of them are just between 1% and 2%. And it's the same thing for every year, Medicare dependent as well as the low volume adjustment. So these got extended to the end of calendar year 24 as part of the CAA of 2024. So unless we have some congressional intervention, so this has gone on since I think 2019. they keep extending this. Before they should just extend it through the end of the fiscal year, they've decided to let's extend it to the end of the calendar year because that seems to be when the CAA is issued at the end of the calendar year. So if they're currently set to expire at the end of this year for both MDH and low volume. So there are some certain timeframes if there's no congressional intervention. So those that are current MDHs and you want to request SCH status, you must do that by December 2024 for that to be effective. So there's no disruption in the payment starting 1/1/25. Similarly, with the low volume adjustment, that enhanced criteria is set to expire at the end of this calendar year. And that is the current criteria. When they go back, they revert to the pre-2011 criteria. Most of the hospitals, there's certainly a few that still qualify, but many of them who are currently qualifying will lose that qualification. And remember that this is an annual request for the low volume adjustment. So you do have until September 1 of 2024 to request low volume status for fiscal year 25. Again, depending upon what criteria is going to be in place. All right, and now I'll turn this over to Ryan.
All right. Well, thanks, Robert. Hey, Fred, if you don't mind, I popped on earlier because I had a question, and I was curious of your response. And sorry, folks, this wasn't scripted or anything. I was just curious. When you commented, or when you had that slide where you were talking about the comments, you know, obviously everybody on this phone knows that, you know, whatever 2.6 increase is woefully inadequate. Do you think there's a likelihood that CMS updates that factor? You know what I mean? Like, didn't they do that a couple years ago? You know, I don't want to get folks' hopes up, but I can't remember. I feel like it was a couple years ago that they did actually increase it quite a bit between the proposed and final, but that doesn't happen very often, right?
No, it
I'm
doesn't.
sorry,
It's a good question, Ryan. And actually, last year it did go up a bit for proposed to final. I think the prior year it did a bit too. Oh, Ryan, I think I'm getting feedback here. But anyway, so what some of the reasons why it goes up from the proposed rule to the final rule when you talk about the market basket is because CMS does take a look at their source data that they're using to assess that market basket increase, and there can be a change in some of the projections, you know, that they're pulling from, and so that's what occurred last year, if I recall, that there was a change in that
Right.
projection of the provider cost inflation, call it piece
Right.
of the market basket.
What you're saying is they don't care about the comments.
You know, no, it's not a result of the comments, unfortunately.
Okay. But it can't hurt. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Fred. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No,
interject
good
there,
question,
but
Mr. Stater.
crossed my mind.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right.
And
Well,
since you're up here, buddy, so take it
I
away.
am up.
Ron.
Yeah. So, all right. I have a handful of slides here. There's probably the next 6 or so slides reflect this labor market update, which if you read the rule, it makes up a good chunk of the wage index section. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on here. As Fred alluded to in the addendums to this, or the exhibits, I suppose, we have some further analysis, you know, that shows counties that are changing, CVSAs, et cetera. You know, this slide deck will be available to you, so I encourage you to refer to it. Check out that section in more depth if you think you have a hospital that's impacted by this labor market change. So I'll speak to kind of the high-level changes here, but like I said, you know, certainly refer back to that detail if you think you're impacted. So just high level, so labor markets, right? We have CVSAs in the wage index. CVSAs are derived based on, you know, loosely based on counties, but it all stems from this Office of Management Budget, census data, right? And so the last update we had to this was based on the 2010 census, which, if for those of you going back in time, was federal year 2015, was the last time we had kind of a major proposed labor market change. We did have what I'll describe as an interim in like 2020, which only impacted a certain part of the country, notably Jersey and different areas of the Northeast. But this was kind of the full update based on the 2020 census. So we knew this was coming. And so, like I said, there's a lot of language in here to show these new markets based on the latest OMB bulletin that came out last year. So just high level here on this slide, we've got urban to rural changes, right? So you're going from a urban county to now a quote unquote rural county because your population went below 50,000 or whatnot. There's 53 of those counties, 17 Lugar, which we're not going to get into all the nuances of what Lugar means. If you think you have a Lugar hospital, you know, and you're impacted, we're happy to help dive into that for you. Rural to urban, so meaning you go from a rural county to urban, which that's kind of important, you know, potentially if you have like a critical access hospital that is in a rural county that is now quote unquote urban, you might have an issue that you need to be paying attention to. And we've got a couple slides on that here coming up. So 54 of those counties, and then urban to urban. Urban to urban is just kind of you were subsumed by another CBSA, or the CBSA changed names. Like I know one instance, I think it was in Jersey, New Brunswick, Lakewood became Lakewood, New Brunswick for whatever reason. So it's got a new number now because it's all alphabetical. So the key takeaway here, I'll say, is CMS, you know, if you recall from 2015, they had a lot of transition timing, like, oh, you would phase in, so, you know, any impacts and so forth. CMS now is kind of saying, hey, we've got this 5% permanent cap, which I'll speak to in a different slide. So any, you know, so in other words, that's going to be sufficient to cover any of these changes. It's like, hey, don't worry about it. You're not going to go down more than 5%. So that's kind of what CMS is backing any of these changes on. So they're like I said, in this rule, there's a lot of different, you know, they're very detailed as far as what CBSAs are changing, et cetera. But for your sake, you know, and having to not go back into the rule, you know, refer to our exhibits because we've got it all sort of listed out. Go to the next slide here, Fred. Okay, so again, you know, some more verbiage here, just talking about some of these changes. You know, we've got, you know, 17 of the 53 urban to rural qualify as urban under Lugar. So again, I'm not going to go into all these nuances, but again, these are here for you. We've got 22 counties losing status, 33 rural counties losing Lugar status. Again, a lot of folks are going, what is Lugar? And Lugar was he's a senator, just for the record, and he came up with this Lugar deal, I don't know how many years ago, a number of years ago. And then to even add nuance to this, 8 counties in Connecticut now have these quote unquote planning regions. So I don't know who makes this stuff up, but you know, we've got a slide on that as well.
Yeah, right, and I would just say for those curious what Lugar is, it is the German pistol as well, I think. It's also if you're in a rural area that's near an urban market, you're rural but you're urban. They kind of do an automatic reclass and give you that urban status. And so on a high level, that's what it is. And so, yeah, there are a number of counties that are losing their Lugar status, and there's 17, as you said, Ryan, that are now getting Lugar status. So again, that's why we kind of talked in the beginning about understanding, you know, what's in this rule and understanding if it affects your hospital. Again, you have it broken down by county, so you could check this out if your hospitals kind of fall into any of these counties. You definitely want to pay attention and see if there's any action that you need to take. And we'll talk about that here next, right, Ryan?
Yeah, thanks, Fred. And these 2 slides here are probably the most important sort of references. And I'm not going to go through each little section here, but what we're highlighting here is just if you think you have a hospital impacted, you know, these are kind of the action items, and we've got a recommendation, right? So this first one I'll speak to, critical access, because I mentioned that before. Obviously, critical access is or cost-based reimbursement. If you have a situation where you are going from a rural to an urban area that impacts your critical access hospital status, that could be a big deal, right? Obviously, you could be losing cost-based reimbursement. So what CMS proposes here is they follow this 2-year transition period, and we've got a reference to the regulations down there. So you certainly need to evaluate this, because what CMS says is, and I think we've got a slide in a couple minutes here, that speaks to, you have the opportunity to basically redesignate back to rural under these regulations, right? 412103 is the quote unquote rural regulation, and that would allow you to, assuming you qualify, that would allow you to retain this 2-year transition period. So you'll get an extra 2 years to basically figure it out, and then it'll go away. Then you're essentially going to be urban. But if you don't do that, then when October 1 hits, right, when the federal year hits, then you're now an urban hospital going to start receiving the IPPS rates. So if you're in that situation, you certainly want to be evaluating that. And I believe, Fred, you read on this too. I think you have until October 1 to make to basically file
and we'll
for
talk
that
about that on
rural
that.
status.
That's right, Ryan, and we'll talk about that a little bit further on another slide, because I think CMS's recommendation is a little bit confusing. One, because I don't think a critical access hospital would really ever qualify for rural status,
Right.
unless it's in a census tract, perhaps. We do know that there's 26 critical access hospitals that are going to have to probably figure this out. I also don't want to forget some critical access hospitals are deemed to be essential providers by their states and kind of get grandfathered into critical access status. So it's one of the things that you'd want to look at is to see, is there a way if you're a hospital impacted by this, for you to retain that rural status by some enabling legislation or by some deal between the state and the feds. But I think the last thing that the feds really want to do is impact rural safety net providers, and that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So absolutely. Go ahead, Ryan. Next one.
Yeah, and similarly, I mean, the next couple sections here, sole communities, Medicare dependent, RRCs, if you're going from a rural to urban and so forth, you could lose that status. So you want to evaluate that. Same kind of deal. You can reclassify as rural and re-achieve, so to speak, that sole community status. So you want to pay attention to that. Wage index, there is a section, obviously, if you're changing CBSAs or something, there's a section in the Rule 2 that speaks to those, and I think, like we've talked about in the addendum, we flagged those, and then we mentioned the Luger status as well. So
yeah, and I would just say, too, so without getting overly complicated on the wage index piece, you can be shifted, obviously, into another market, or like you said, Ryan, subsumed into another CBSA. The reclasses can be confusing. If you're a provider that's impacted by a change in your CBSA or a change to where you're reclassified to, in the rule, CMS kind of took some liberties in saying, okay, if your CBSA name changed, right, they're just going to put you into whatever that new CBSA is. But if there were urban or rural changes within that CBSA, CMS does make some decisions. They reclassify some hospitals back to their home CBSAs. And there are tables in the rule. They're not the tables that are in Excel, the nice tables you could download off of the CMS page, but in the rule itself, they list the hospitals that have to do some evaluation on their reclassifications. And again, so you want to your point, Ryan, you start with table 2 to see where you're reclassified to. Does that make sense? And then being familiar with whatever market you're in, the next step is assessing, is there somewhere better for me to be? And because if you were kicked out of your reclass because that CBSA no longer exists or changed, I believe you can this year apply for a reclassification to a new market for federal year 25. At this point, usually you're applying for reclassifications for 26, but because of this change, CMS is recognizing that there are certain hospitals that need to make some changes. I think they're willing to work with you there. So again, just want to keep your eyes peeled for that.
yeah, it's a good point, Fred. And like you said, they list those out, of those providers that are impacted by a change. So no, it's a good point. A couple more areas just to consider here, right? So DISH is impacted if you go from a rural to urban, right? Rural's less than 500 beds are capped. So you got to, again, evaluate your rural referral center status. GME, you've got this rural teaching track changes, no loss on 30% add-on. CMS made sure you're grandfathered in, right? So if you're rural and you go to urban, you're grandfathered in. I can't imagine that this impacts too many hospitals, but it's just good to know that that is out there. And then the alternative payments, that could be impacted.
Yeah, and I'll
well,
just,
right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're in a value-based program,
Right.
sometimes you're attributed with being grouped with other urban or rural hospitals, so you just want to know if there's any changes to that. As Robert talks about the Teams model, there's really no relationship here. Teams is not using the CBSAs as where they draw the line between urban and rural. They're being more inclusive of other rural provider types for that. And yeah, if you are one of the DSH hospitals that all of a sudden is capped at 12% from going from urban to rural, less than 500 beds, there's a phase-in period where effectively you get 2/3 urban, 1/3 rural, and then they flip it next year to be 2/3 rural, 1/3 urban, and then year 3 you're capped fully at that 12% as a rural provider, unless you can do the rural two-step, as we call it, by becoming rural and rural referral centers. Ryan, you want to talk about
this? Speak to this?
I could speak to this, Ryan, because this has been something I've been scratching my brain on all week, is what the heck is CMS talking about here? Is what they say is, if you're one of these hospitals that's affected, they say, just apply for rural status under, section 412.103. They say prior to 10/1/24. Well, first of all, you really can't. Not everybody could apply for rural status. If you also need to apply for rural referral center status, because in order to become a rural referral center, you have to do so in the last quarter of your fiscal year. The other thought is, I don't think a lot of these hospitals would qualify for 412.103 status unless they're in a rural census tract. All the other areas, you need some sort of state law, which you could get, designating you as a rural provider, or an area as a rural provider. But this third, which like I said, we commonly call the rural two-step, meaning you qualify for rural referral center status, which then gives you rural status. Well, those rural referral center criteria are in large part meant for more large, sophisticated providers, for teaching providers, as a for instance, right? Because they're referral centers. And so, I think CMS's recommendation here is a little short-sighted. I think that these affected hospitals should probably comment in the rule and maybe get CMS to think a little bit more deeply about how they can retain rural status and not lose their add-on payments.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. And I'll just
Ryan,
mention there for a sec, like you said, the rural referral center status is meant for academic, larger teaching hospitals over 275 beds, or they have alternative criteria that, one of the minimum thresholds is 5,000 discharges. How many COs out there have 5,000 discharges, right?
Right.
Like, I'm not sure, So.
Yep. None.
All right, well, let's get into the meat of the wage index, right? After all that labor market nonsense, this is the fun part, right? So I wanted to highlight kind of what's going on with the national average hourly wage trend. I'm sure a lot of folks out there have seen this or are experiencing this, right? So going all the way back to 2022, we saw 2.7% increase to 23, right? That's been fairly standard over the years, right? 2.5, 3%. And then, 23 to 24, we're kind of getting closer to COVID years. What happened? 2.7 to 5.5. Whoa, we had a pretty big jump. Now, all of a sudden, we see an 8.7% jump. Our national average hourly wage is going from $50.35 to $54.73. 8.7%, folks, is a big number, right? And it's actually closer to 9 based on the April puff that was just released. So it's actually upticked even a little more. So what that essentially means is if your CBSA, if your average hourly wage trend is not keeping up with that 9% increase, you're going to see a drop in the wage index. So we're seeing wide variations of wage indices, going up and down in 25. And notably, we're seeing a lot of people hitting that 5% cap, right? That we talked about because of this. So we've got a couple slides in here, and I won't go through these in too much detail, but, they're here just highlighting some of these changes. So what we're highlighting here, increases in your average hourly wage, not necessarily your wage index, but the average hourly wage, and kind of that column C there, we've got that little arrow. Look at some of these increases, 34%, 35%, or 34.36, et cetera, over 20%. Now, mind you, most of these are kind of single hospital CBSAs with a couple exceptions like Orlando and so forth. One takeaway, I'll kind of an observation I had as I was evaluating, like what's happening? Why are we, where are these increases happening? 9% is a big number. A lot of folks, obviously this is using 2021 federal year data, right? Which is kind of in the heart of COVID, we're in the middle of the PHE and so forth. Contract labor was up, right? Everybody experienced, you see the reports, everybody was experiencing significant increases in contract labor. And what I noticed, if you notice kind of some of these markets, these are smaller markets, right? So potentially they had increases in their contract labor, which impacted, which led to some of these increases. In some of the bigger markets, notably like on the West Coast and here in California and New York, some of these places, yeah, sure, maybe they saw some contract labor increases as well, but the degree of those increases didn't have as much of an effect on the overall average hourly wage, right? If that makes sense, right? So I'll give you an example, like Los Angeles, there's $20 billion of salaries in Los Angeles. And yeah, maybe you had an increase in contract labor of $100 million or whatever it was. Forgive the numbers here, I'm making this up. That is only going to have so much effect on the overall. But in some of these smaller markets, you can move the needle a lot more on these contract labors. And it's kind of what we're seeing. So in other words, what I'm getting at is a lot of these kind of smaller markets are seeing significant increases across the country, which, I think part of that just led into the higher national average hourly wage that we're seeing. So it's not so much that California and some of these other places weren't keeping up. It's just, maybe the contract labor didn't have as much of an impact as it did in some of these other markets. So, and that's kind of, case in point here to some degree, Springfield, Ohio, State College, PA, and some of these smaller markets. Go ahead and go to the next slide.
Thanks, Brian. And I think, sorry, I was responding to a question here. I think the other thing, your point's really valid, and it's a trend we'll see. And I just moved to the top 10 decreases. In the same, look, it's the same. It's major swings in wage index are typically in markets that have very few hospitals, right? Because it's the same. It's just like you said, and Ryan, so here are the top 10 areas that lost, but look, it's one hospital, 2211, right? So if something happens at one hospital, that's all it takes. And without stealing your thunder too much, Ryan, as you pointed out before, the proposed rule isn't the final say-all. There's a lot that happens between the proposed and final rule. One thing is, Ryan, when it comes to the wage index, people are going to withdraw some reclassification. So for folks that are looking at their rural floor or they're looking at their CBSA, especially if you're reclassified, just always put a little pin in that. Is it going to change? And we always promote, hey, everybody needs to be talking to each other so you could see what's going to happen by the time when that final rule comes out. The other thing to your point, Ryan, about contract labor being disallowed, if you look at all of these folks that had these large decreases in the proposed rule, well, look at what happened between then and the April public use file, right? So Albany, Georgia, it looked like they were going to see this tremendous loss, but not really, because they were able to fight back with their appeal or a response to the MAC and get those costs added back. And so you want to consider that. That's one of the dangerous things, because wage index drives so much revenue for providers. It's dangerous to always just rely on that proposed rule for what the impact of that wage index. Because it's not final.
And
Ryan, I'll skip here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just note there, on those decreases, obviously we have the 5% stop loss cap, right? So even though we're showing that change, they'll be mitigated, right, in some of these areas. Mm-hmm. But it's a very good point, right? Because I always say the proposed rule is dangerous because it's so subject to change, at least when you're talking wage index, right? Between the rural floor applications and reclasses moving around, you just can't rely on it. Aside from the fact that the data is stale, right? It's from February data before rebuttals and all these things. So you can see some wild swings between the proposed and final. So. All right, let's move on. And then to sort of add to matters, right, we had a new OCMIC survey application this year, right? Every 3 years we do these OCMIC surveys, which some of you may recall from doing last year. It's now being applied to the wage data. So we're just highlighting some areas here where we saw a change, right? So these are changes in the OCMIC's impact year over year, right? So OCMIX is applied at a hospital level, and then it kind of rolls up, into the CBSAs. And so you can see some of these markets had a $3, this first one here, $3.51 change in terms of the impact of the OCMIX on the overall average hourly wage. So it actually increased it by $3.51 compared to the prior year. That's a big swing. I would kind of question some of these, like, did you really have that much of a change in your sort of labor, the composition of your labor? Maybe you just did a better job preparing it. Maybe you just had to reevaluate kind of some of the job mappings. As you can see here too, I think, Fred, like you alluded to, some of these are smaller, one-off, 1-2 hospitals, CBSAs. So some minor change in how you're reporting could have a dramatic impact, right? So just highlighting a few of those, and I think the next slide speaks to the decreases, right, where we had some folks that are now seeing decreases to their average hourly wage as a result of the new surveys, right?
Yep, and same,
So
this...
$2, $3,
Yeah, yep.
And same deal here, right, Fred? So I would question, are these right? If you have a hospital in one of these CBSAs, I might reconsider and say, hey, did we file that right? What changed? Did we actually change the way we were hiring our nursing staff, or did we just have a change in the process? And bear in mind, you have a chance to revise these, right? So every year, even though this survey will be applied for the next 3 federal years, you can go in just like you do every year for wage index revisions. You can go back and change your occupational mix. Obviously, you got to support it and go through the audit again. But just keep that in mind if you're one of these CBSAs that are impacted. And then, again, we spoke about this briefly. This is showing top 10 increases from the proposed to the April data, right? What they call the quote-unquote final average hourly wage, or PUF. And like Fred alluded to, you see some significant swings. I guess one big one here is Columbus, right? So Columbus had 16 hospitals, and yet they had an increase from, $2.59. So that's good for folks in Columbus. But yeah, look at Texarkana, $15. Whew. And maybe that was a contract labor issue, but if you're interested, if anybody wants to reach out to me, certainly feel free. My contact information is at the end there. We have models where we obviously recalculate the average hourly wage using the latest data. So if you're ever interested in kind of seeing where potentially things change, just let me know, and we can provide that. Because our files that Fred alluded to earlier will, they're obviously based on the proposed rule data at this point, the impact files. All right, let's keep moving along here. Okay, so this slide, I don't even think we changed it from last year. Because it's these, what I'll call special wage index provisions that are still in play. 5% cap I've been talking about, that's permanent now to where your wage index cannot drop more than 5% from the prior year. State rural floor, this changed last year in terms of the inclusion of these rural two-step hospitals, as we call them, and this quote-unquote hold harmless policy. So there's opportunity, I don't want to say opportunity, we're going to see a lot of, variations in the state rural floors over the course of the next, as reclasses are withdrawn and canceled and people are evaluating their statewide rural floor. We'll see where that all plays out. But that continues to be in play in 25, as well as this high-low adjustment, right, which we call it the bottom quartile adjustment. So anybody in the bottom 25% quartile is still seeing this bump. And we were a little surprised to see that. I'm sure folks will be commenting on it because CMS, they've lost in court to apply that, so that 25% is still there, but there's I think Fred had it in a previous slide, there's a budget neutrality factor that reduces everybody's rates by a little bit as a result of this application. CMS lost in court and appealed it, and I believe that appeal case is still pending a decision. And so we'll see if that actually gets decided before the final rules issue. We'll see if CMS throws in the towel, so to speak, on that. Obviously, I don't think they're going to throw in the towel on the 25%, but potentially pulling out that budget neutrality impact. But we'll see. Right now, it's still in there. And they're also proposing to extend it for another however many years, All right, last slide for me, so we can keep this moving along. Keep this as a reference. These are important dates to keep in mind. June 7th, this speaks to rural redesignation lock-in. So if you're trying to redesignate to get yourself included in the rural calculation, you have to do it by June 7th. June 14th, so probably the big date to highlight is June 14th, 2024. It's actually June 16th, but June 16th is a Sunday, so we're recommending the 14th. This is the MGCRB terminations and withdrawals, the cancellations that we kind of spoke of a little bit. So you have to get those in by the 14th if you're going to move from one CBSA to next, and that speaks to like if you had a CBSA change or something where you're not in a reclass spot where you thought you should be. And last thing I'll point out here is I think it's asterisk number 2 here maybe. So in the 25 rule, they are actually proposing to kind of move up this timeline by approximately, well, it'd be probably like 30 days or so, to within 45 days of the public display of the annual notice. I mean, it's very confusing, as opposed to the 45 days when it's actually published in the Federal Register, right? And which is historically what it's been. So bottom line is they're proposing to move this timeline up for withdrawals and terminations by quite a bit. I think that would be like May 24th or something if the math served this right this year. But that's in proposal, which means we still have the current status, so to speak, which is 45 days after it's published, which turns out to be June 16th or so. But note that going forward, they could potentially move that timeline up.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate it, man.
All right.
All right. I'm gonna cover this next section mostly on uncompensated care. We have a half hour and a decent amount left, so a lot of this is pretty routine at this point. So I'm not gonna kill too many brain cells going through this section. Good news is there's some more dollars put in. The pool's at $6.6 billion. It's up from 24, still down from 23, but headed in the right direction. If we look at over the course of time, I think the most important piece of this slide is to recognize that, if you're trying to understand what am I paid when I report something on my worksheet as 10, well, this year you're paid 19% of that cost. Last year it was 17, and that percentage is just based upon wherever the pool is established. Like we said, there's still a significant gap. I mean, if we go all the way back to 21, CMS was paying a lot more for the uncompensated care pool at 26% ratio. And then it started to dip down 21 to 20 to 17, and then now we're finally back up to 19%. And so really how we get there is what CMS does is they estimate DISH payments for the whole year before UC DISH. So if there was never any ACA, the DISH payments hospitals would receive would be about $13.4 billion. These Factor 1 updates, this Factor 1 and Factor 2, this is really what drives the program. See, Factor 1 is a lot better this year than it has been, and that's because we're kind of moving away from some of that bad data that drives this Factor 1 COVID adjustments from those COVID years, I should say. And also there's a projection that more people are going to be uninsured. And so last year, I think people were a little upset with this number here. They didn't believe the CMS's projection of the uninsured rate, and that's a large reason why the pool went down last year. So this is effectively how it works. Just takes the base year, applies these adjustments. So you take 75% of projected DISH payments, and that's where when people say that you get 25 to 75%, this is what they're talking about. And then 62% of that number, so 62% of 75% of DISH payments is $6.5 billion. They have the supplemental pool for other provider types, so that's how we get to $6.6 billion this year. Just real quick, want to just show, again, I'm not going to spend too much time, but if you're ever curious how this all works, here's the base. These are all the update factors. These update factors are important, though, because this is what drives that Factor 1 adjustment from the base year that they're using. So they're effectively taking a current value, trying to project what is the present values of these dollars in 2025. Now, I'll talk about it probably on the next slide. I might have a comment, but the objective when I said earlier that it would be great if CMS would listen to MedPAC's recommendation and give us an increase to these update factors. If they increase this by 1.5%, this number here, I'm sorry, this 2.6% here, that's worth about $100 million to the UC dish pool. I mean, for the whole country, it's not much, but it still moves the dial. But then you start to say, well, all these numbers are understated too. And if you got CMS to say, okay, well, we've historically understated the market basket, and you got them to agree to fix it in the UC dish pool, you could definitely by that point drive in another, $500 million of an increase. So that's really what we're coming at with our comments here is that, hey, update the dish pool by this market basket adjustment. And then don't forget that the prior years are understated too, right? And so those are our suggested comments on bringing some more dollars into that UC dish pool, because there's plenty more that the government could pay for. Right now, it's only 19% of those costs, right? And so it'd be nice if they picked up a bigger part of the tab there. If you're ever curious how Factor 2, which is a measurement of the change in the uninsured population since the ACA, they basically say before the ACA, there was 14% of our nation's population was uninsured. This year, they're projecting for 25 that number to be 8.7%. They do some magical percentage math here, and that's how you get to the 62.1. Last year, that number landed at 59.3, and it's really because of these two numbers, the projection of the uninsured change in 2025. Just one thing, another thing we want to say is you can amend your cost reports if you're finding that there's opportunities to increase your uncompensated care because CMS is using a 3-year average. So what we sometimes see is a provider is, working and maybe putting a different lens on their uncompensated care reporting. They might find an opportunity to find more costs on like a 21 cost report or a 22 cost report. As long as the other prior 2 cost reports are still in play, because it's an average of 3 years that CMS is using, the MACs should have to technically and should be working with you if you request an amended cost report to fix those other years. And that's important because it would increase your UC dish payment if you have other cost report years affected. We think if you wanted to do that for 2026, it would be an activity I would recommend doing as you're doing your 2022 S10 audits right now to get it in by the end of the year, no later than CMS likes to use the March HCRIS data set for this program. We're saying you have until July 9th if you are looking at CMS's uncompensated care costs for your hospital and you see any mishandling of the data. The rule is 60 days from the display date, which is a Sunday. And so we're saying just get it in by that Friday to be conservative. If there's an issue where you don't agree with the numbers that are in the CMS table for your uncompensated care costs. We shall not forget about MedPAC's recommendation. CMS brings it up again, and in MedPAC's 2024 report, they continue to beat the drum that they want to shake up the DISH program. They want to use the Medicare Safety Net Index, which is a composite of these 3 things here, notably a provider share of patients that receive Medicare dual eligible Part D, low income subsidy. Uncompensated care cost is a portion of this, and so is the Medicare share of total inpatient days. MedPAC says if Medicare were to adopt this recommendation, which would require legislation, which would be tough because the way that DISH works now, especially with uncompensated care, is deeply rooted in the ACA. So I don't know how you would untangle that. But if they were to do so, they're saying they would add $4 billion to the pool of funds, and that they would make sure that there's an IPPS and an OPPS component to that. So just good to keep your, because I think the most important takeaway with the safety net index is who knows if they'll ever use it for DISH reimbursement, but they use it for other programs. So when CMS was evaluating how to determine who a safety net hospital is for their TEAMS model, they did look at this safety net index as a potential criteria for that. So just something for us to know that is a new measurement in our industry, and we'll see what it evolves to. That, Tom, I'm going to kick it over to you, sir, to talk about GME. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Fred. Hi, everybody. So there were a handful of GME-related provisions in the proposed rule. The first was a change to Section 126 of the CAA from 2021. That's the rule that allowed for 1,000 extra FTE slots to be distributed into the system through an application process. It was a 5-year thing. It's 200 slots per year, so it's not tremendously large. But one of the provisions in that rule said that at least 10% of the new slots, or 100 slots, need to go to each of the 4 categories of applicants. And through the first 2 rounds, which are complete now, the CMS has found that they're not really close to meeting that requirement for category 4, which is hospitals that operate programs that are physically located in HPSs. They've only allocated maybe 15 or so FTEs to those category 4 applicants. So for the final 2 rounds, for round 4 and 5, they're going to prioritize that category. I assume the way they're going to do it is they're going to do that until they get up to the required 100 slots. And then from that point on, they'll go back to the regular rules for distributing the FTEs under 126. So it's really just a change to the priority for that rule to the relatively small impact that that rule has. The second item is there's another law that's similar to Section 126, but it's actually unrelated. It's a one-time distribution. The law authorized for 200 additional slots to be released. They're going to use a very similar approach to doing it. It's 200 slots that'll be distributed through the application process. In this case, though, at least 100 of those slots need to go to psychiatry and psych subspecialty programs. There is a pretty big difference in this round of application I'll talk about in a second, but there's a sort of a even allocation of up to 1 slot to every program or every hospital that applies that has a qualified application. And once they do that even allocation, they're going to release the rest of the slots very similar to Section 126, but there may not be any left after the allocation. No one hospital can get more than 10 FTEs. And the way they're going to do it, at least initially, looks like no one hospital is even going to get anywhere close to 10 FTEs. There's a March 31st deadline, next March 31st, 2025. And then the hospitals that receive those slots they'll be effective on July 1st of 2026. So you could go to the next one, Fred, if you don't mind. So to demonstrate how they're going to do this, and this is the part that's different than how they've done Section 126, is every hospital that applies is going to get up to 1 slot, and they're going to do that evenly. So CMS provided some examples of how this will work. If 180 hospitals were to apply, then each of them would get 1 FTE. And then the 20 that are left after that would be allocated based on HPSA scores, which is the way they did it for Section 126. But same thing, if 200 hospitals apply, they'd each get 1 FTE, but then there would be no FTEs left for any other allocations. If more than 200 hospitals apply, in this example, 350, they would allocate the 200 slots among them, and they would each get 0.57 FTEs. So, for a little perspective on this, in rounds 1 and 2 of the Section 126 allocations, where they both had 200 slots per year, there were 291 applications for round 1, and there were 229 applications for round 2. So in all likelihood, there will be more than 200 hospitals that will apply, which basically means in my mind that this is a pretty feeble attempt by Congress to put more slots into the system, because in all likelihood, there's going to be over 200 hospitals that will each get less than 1 FTE. So it's certainly not material, and it's certainly not big enough to incent a hospital to start a brand new program or to expand an existing program simply because of this rule. However, CMS is considering an alternative to how they're going to do this, which would make probably more sense, albeit kind of strange, is what they're thinking of bypassing this requirement for this even allocation. And what they would do is give all the hospitals that apply 0.01 FTEs. So, for example, if 200 hospitals were to apply, they'd each get 0.01 FTEs, which would amount to 2 FTEs in total. And that would preserve the other 198 slots so that they can allocate them based on HPSA scores. So, they're asking for public comments as to whether they should go that route. That would at least be more meaningful to the few hospitals that would win the allocations. The third provision is some additional rule making related to new programs. CMS for a long time has had provisions that allow hospitals that have never had teaching before to start brand new programs. And this also applies to rural hospitals that have the ability to start new programs. But if a hospital in one of those categories starts a brand new program, there's a 5-year build-up period where a hospital can build a cap for that new program over the first 5 years of the program, and then that cap becomes permanent. But CMS has always been very cautious and actually really skeptical as to and really tries to make sure that any new program is truly a new program. In order to be able to build new caps for a program, it has to be literally brand new. It can't be sort of moving an existing program from another hospital to a new hospital. It can't be an expansion of an existing program. So they've always been, in my mind, sometimes too sort of zealous about making sure that all these programs that are brand new are truly brand new. And the way they've always done that is they've had some sort of criteria for maybe 15 years now or so that says that they in order to demonstrate that it's a new program, all the residents need to be new. So they need to be PGY1s, fresh out of the match, fresh out of medical school, or at least residents that don't have any prior training within the specialty. So if it's a resident that transferred maybe from a different specialty into a new program here, that would qualify. And they've always had rules, well, at least for 15 years or so, they've had rules that the program director needs to be new. They can't be somebody who's a program director at a different program that's sort of moving to a new hospital to sort of expand that program. They literally want to be a new program. And they apply some of that logic to the attending physicians who are faculty as well. So the change that is in part of the proposed rule is that they really want to codify or make these more concrete as to how they will apply these changes, because they've always said that they want the overwhelming majority of the residents and the faculty to be new under their definition. But they never really defined what that meant. And there's been a lot of question about it. So now what they're trying to do is just say, what they are doing is just say that they're going to define a standard that says their proposals that 90% of the residents have to meet that category of new residents. So you could have up to 10% of the new resident or the residents in the new program that maybe are not brand new, because some programs like to hire a PGY 2 or 3 out of another program just to have some more experienced residents in the program. And the CMS wants to sort of define that standard at 90%. Probably more difficult is the idea of whether the program director is truly new, and even more so the faculty. So CMS doesn't really have a defined new rule on this. They're essentially asking for comments from the industry stakeholders to help them determine how they might best really tighten the screws on what exactly qualifies as a new program. So for these categories on the right side, they're asking for comments from the stakeholders in teaching environments as to how they would define what constitute a new faculty member. Does it have to be somebody who was never a faculty member, or somebody maybe who hasn't taught in a GME program for maybe 5 years or 10 years? They also recognize that programs in small rural areas or small programs would have a difficult time hiring all brand new residents and all brand new faculty and program directors, just because they have a limited labor market. So the CMS is considering defining a small residency program that they would relax the rules on a little bit. And they're also asking for some comments on the commingling of residents in a situation where maybe a new program starts at a hospital, but the residents do rotations in an existing program, and it's basically working in another program that already existed, and they're questioning whether they should create some rules around that. So really, they're just asking for some comments from the industry as to how they might implement these rules. And then lastly, this is just another round of 2 hospitals that closed, McLaren St. Luke's in Toledo, South City Hospital in St. Louis. Under Section 5506 of the ACA, those hospitals had cap slots that CMS will reallocate to hospitals that apply for them. There's actually a pretty good number of FTE slots. For most rounds, this is round 21 and 22 for closed GME teaching hospitals. For almost all the rounds that there's been so far, the typical thing is that you'll see 30 or 40 hospitals apply for those slots. It's usually hospitals from all over the country that aren't even in the geographic area sometimes, and many hospitals just apply every year, every time a hospital closes, just to see if they can get lucky and get some slots. But the reality is almost always the slots that are reallocated will go to the hospitals that take on the residents from the programs that close. So if there's a hospital nearby that took on the displaced residents from a closed program, and they plan on continuing that program or starting a new program to replace it, they're going to be the hospitals that will win the slot. So, but there is an application process, and the deadline is July 9th. So that's all I've got for Jimmy, Fred.
Thanks, Tom. And Robert, it's your favorite part of the presentation where you have 13 minutes to talk about outlier reconciliation changes and a brand new alternative payment model for teams. Can you do it, Robert, in 13 minutes?
Out there. Fred, I guess I am taking it to the end, right?
You're taking it. Do it up, Robert.
So, all right, this is not part of the proposed rule, but we thought it would be important to talk about it because this change request came out at the end of March of this year. And typically the outlier reconciliation process doesn't affect the hospitals. The CMS decided they're going to add some criteria to where there's going to be some outlier reconciliation. And I think now this is going to apply to most hospitals, and we'll walk through it. So the changes become effective for cost reporting periods beginning on or after October 1 of 24. So obviously none of us have filed a cost report. This is your fiscal year 25 cost report. But really how you're filing your 24 cost report is then going to be is going to affect how you get paid in 25. So the current criteria is to be subject to the outlier reconciliation is if your actual operating cost to charge ratio in that specific cost reporting year has changed plus or minus 10 percentage points, up or down, used to make outlier payments. And then also that or relates to the 1B there, or we don't have the 1B, but the revised criteria. And that your operating and capital outlier payments exceed at least $500,000. So they're only looking at the operating cost to charge ratio, not the operating and capital. So the operating cost to charge ratio has changed. The revised criteria now is if your actual operating cost to charge ratio has changed plus or minus 20%. So not 20 or 10 percentage points, we're talking 20% used to make outlier payments. And also that you still have operating and capital outlier payments greater than 500,000. So what does this mean? So I just put some examples here of what of how this now plays into effect. So let's say on an interim basis, let's say you filed your 22 cost report. So if you're June 30th, 23, and even you're 9/30/23, you probably already have updated cost of charge ratios for outliers. Obviously the 12/31s have not filed their 23 cost report, but let's say you're on interim basis at 40%. But the actual for in this case, your 24 fiscal year cost report is 32%. Now, under the old methodology, a 10 percentage point has not occurred. We only have an 8 percentage point change, so then outlier reconciliation doesn't qualify. However, the change here in the percentage is a 20% change. So now we have triggered an outlier reconciliation. And as you can see, the lower your cost of charge ratio is, just even the smallest change is going to be can trigger this 20% outlier reconciliation. So most hospitals within the country from a cost of charge ratio are within this 15% to maybe even the high 20s. There are very few that are above 30 and into the 40 range because of just the increases in your charge master charges, which are typically 5-6%, maybe even higher than that. It all depends on how the charge master increases from year to year, but your costs may not increase at that same rate. So, just quite simply, right, the cost charge ratio is your total cost divided by your total charges at gross. So in this case, if from your interim, and typically your cost of charge ratio decreases from year to year, but if it decreases by such a significant amount, you're going to be subject to outlier reconciliation for that year. So understanding how your charges have increased or decreased, and obviously your costs, but most importantly, how your charges have increased from year to year, especially with your charge master updates, you have to keep in mind that this is going to have an impact on your outliers. Now, of course, outliers are never a good thing. If you're getting, people treat it like it's a part of reimbursement. Really, it's just an extra reimbursement because you have a high length of stay, really, or high cost cases in relation to the DRG payment. You know, obviously, you want to get those patients out sooner. I understand there's some placement issues, but Outliers is just to help you with those high cost cases. All right, on the flip side, because it's not just one way, it can go the other way. Meaning that your interim cost of charge ratio, in comparison to your actual in comparison to your interim has increased by 20%. So I kind of just flip these numbers around with the actual. So, you know, there's the first one with the 0.48 to the 0.4, we don't have a 10 percentage point change in there. So under the current criteria, it would not trigger an outlier reconciliation. But with the change request, it now will. In this case, we have a 20% change. So as you can see, we go further down with the between actual and interim. So this is a good thing. So then you have the ability to get additional payments if your cost of charge ratio has changed from year to year, whether you maybe kept charges flat from year to year or costs have significantly increased for whatever reason between years, and that's going to affect how the outlier payments occur. So something to keep an eye on as you go from year to year. All right, so TEAM, another acronym that we need to learn about, the alternative payments, or we have another bundled payment episode. So this was all created by the Affordable Care Act. Many of us may be familiar with the CJR, the Comprehensive Care for Joint Replacement, mandatory, you know, through select CBSAs. And then I think there was a cardiac one, and then there's the BPCI. I think the cardiac one was voluntary, and the BPCI is probably voluntary as well. So now CMS is expanding to another transforming episode accountability model. This is going to be a mandatory 5-year episode-based payment system, starting with performance years of 26 through the end of 2030. It is just limited to IPPS hospitals, so your critical access hospitals, children's hospitals, PPS exempt cancer hospitals are not subject to this model. So hospitals will be randomly selected, so it'll be similar to like a lottery, through random sampling of about 800 CBSAs. They're going to create these 17 eligible stratums to have some type of randomness to it. Those CBSAs that were not part of previous bundles are going to get a higher weight because they want definitely to expand it. Those that have a higher amount of cases in those 5 surgical episode categories at the bottom are also going to have a higher weight, meaning you have a higher chance of being selected. And then those CBSAs that have safety net hospitals with those categories are also going to be have higher weight, kind of like the NBA lottery where you have a higher weight assigned to you, which means you have a higher chance of being selected. So the CMS is targeting a final selection of about 25% of those eligible CBSAs. There's no timetable as to when you'll be notified or when that list of CBSAs would be published. My guess is probably going to be sometime in early 2025. Okay, so what does this mean as far as payment and risk that's involved? So for everyone in performance year 1, all participants, to create some type of a transition. So there's only upside risk, and which means that if you're not hitting the target, you're not going to be penalized for that. But however, if you exceed the target, but they're going to limit to the gain at 10% with a stop gain limit. They're also talking about, and this is all, you know, all proposed rules, so they're always seeking comments on this. If maybe there's an opt-in option for hospitals that weren't selected in one of those CBSAs, that maybe you can also join and get into this model here. Now for performance years 2 through 5, there's a different category between whether you're either a safety net, rural, MDH, sole community hospital, essential access community hospital, or then the rest would be that track 3. So they're going to limit the upside and downside risk to no more than 10%, both from a gain and a loss standpoint, if you are in one of those categories. However, if you're not in one of those categories, then you have upside and downside risk of 20%, either a gain or a loss. They're also talking about another that's why it says in track 3, performance years 1 through 5, that maybe hospitals can opt in to go directly into track 3 and bypassing track 1, especially if you for the opportunity for gain to get up to that 20% stop gain. So definitely another opportunity for hospitals that are the whole reason they're doing this is because of the fragmentation of care. So I'm kind of walking through here just to get a high level picture of what this all means. So in reality, hospitals that perform the same procedure in the same city, the Medicare spend can be significantly different. And then we're talking about the Medicare spend, we're not talking about just the DRG. And we're not talking about the add-ons for medical education, DISH, UCC. Those are all, if you remove all of that, obviously the wage index is exactly the same in that CBSA, and the relative weight for those DRGs are exactly the same. It's all the other procedures that are happening with that patient, the other spending, whether that's professional Part B, outpatient services, rehospitalization, drugs, post-acute care. So, for example, if we just pick one DRG, that it's on average, the DRG should be about, or sorry, the Medicare spend, we're talking from the anchor hospitalization, the 30 days post-hospital discharge. So within that window, obviously the inpatient stay could last, a few, maybe a week or maybe 10 days. All depends on that stay. Then to 30 days post-hospital discharge. So if the average spend is roughly $60,000, just throwing it as an example, and one hospital or two hospitals their spend is about $120,000. Again, all things being equal with respect to payment rates. Something is not right here. Do we have fragment of care, or is there coordination of the care between the various healthcare providers? Because right now, obviously we understand this, is that we're under a utilization payment-based system under Medicare, meaning that the more we utilize, the more we get paid, and there's no quality that's associated with this. So the whole goal of this is to reduce the fragmentation of care, have some care coordination, and obviously reduce the Medicare spend. Medicare estimates that this should reduce the Medicare spend by about $700 million over those 5 years. So, the reconciliation process, it will happen obviously after the performance year is over. There'll be a target price for you from a spend, and then there'll be a reconciliation whether or not you fell within that target price, fell below it or above it. So you may have some downside. For those 5 episode categories, those are the DRGs that will be subject to the model, as well as for outpatient procedures. So we'll have those HCPCS codes. So that starts the time and in the 30 days. So then the other question is, well, what if we just do them outside of the 30 days? And well, CMS is also going to look at that too. So more to come. This is all in proposed rule. It doesn't start until 26, but just an FYI on the radar that your CBSA could be selected. And if your CBSA is selected, it is mandatory for you, unless you have none of those procedures that are being performed. Okay.
Thank you, Robert. You took, I think it was like over 400 pages of the rule this year. It talked about this team model. So I'm sure we all appreciate that download, man, because that was a lot to get through. And we did it by 11:30, so we made it, Robert. Good job getting us to the finish line. Just real quick, we mentioned we have addendums or exhibits, whatever you want to call them here, but this is where we're talking about, you guys can peruse these to see the changes to a few DRGs. If you're curious about a provider in York, in any of these counties that went through changes, we have an addendum that shows urban to rural by each of the counties, which of those are Luger, how many total providers, those include psych and rehab, just so you know, not just IPPS, critical access, Medicare dependent, sole community, rural referral, what's the new name of the CBSA, and then we just threw in what's the change in the wage index. If you just looked at table 3, we know that there's all sorts of considerations for providers to receive different wage indices, but we just wanted to gauge, what does this mean for providers in these counties. So feel free to peruse. There's a lot of slides on this, but we thought it would be some useful material to at least, again, check your providers to see if it should be alphabetical, you know, depending on what category you're in, to see if there's any changes to your provider. Whoop. And there's our pictures, and feel free to reach out to us if anybody has any questions at any time. What I'll say before we conclude here is we are going to follow up this with our news you need to know. So we'll basically another write-up on this. This will be shared with anybody. The recording will be on our website. We'll share a version of the PowerPoint with those that participated today and anybody else who requests it. And I guess before we sign off, was there any questions that we wanted to answer in the chat? Did anybody see anything? Ryan, did you see anything that we needed to respond to?
Is there one Q&A?
Nope. I think we're all good.
Okay. All right, everybody. Well, happy Friday. Enjoy your weekends. And we look forward to continuing to provide updates, and we appreciate you all joining us today. So with that, we will adjourn and talk to you next time. Thanks, guys. Bye.